Some memories aren't meant to survive death, but cellular consciousness doesn't follow the rules of human mortality. The fluorescent lights in the veterinary pathology lab hummed with their familiar mechanical persistence as Maya settled into her late shift routine. 3 a.m. was her favorite time to work. No interruptions, no chatter from the day staff, just her and the specimens waiting in the refrigerated storage units. She pulled on fresh nitrile gloves and reviewed the night's processing list: cardiac tissue from a golden retriever, liver samples from a tabby cat, and several routine biopsies from the morning surgeries. The lab felt like a second home after 2 years of night shifts. She knew exactly how long the centrifuge took to reach optimal speed, which microscope had the clearest resolution, and how to coax the temperamental tissue slicer into producing perfect sections. Maya arranged her instruments with practiced efficiency: scalpel, forceps, slide preparation station, each tool in its designated place on the stainless steel workspace. She began with the cardiac tissue, a sample from a 7-year-old retriever that had died during surgery. The muscle fibers looked healthy under initial examination, deep red and well-structured. Maya positioned a section under the microscope and adjusted the focus, noting the cellular organization for her report. The tissue appeared normal, showing no signs of disease or abnormality. That's when it happened. A flash of sensation that wasn't her own. Running. Grasp beneath paws. The pure joy of chase, of speed. Maya jerked back from the microscope, blinking rapidly. Her heart was racing, and for a moment she felt an almost overwhelming urge to run, to move, to chase something she couldn't name. The sensation faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her staring at the tissue sample with confusion. "Just tired," she whispered to the empty lab, but her voice sounded strange in the silence. She looked at her hands and noticed something that made her stomach clench. Her fingers were still positioned as if holding something, curved in a way that didn't match how she normally held her instruments. The posture felt natural, comfortable even, though she couldn't remember moving them that way. Like paws gripping earth. Maya shook her head and returned to the microscope. The cardiac tissue looked the same as before, just muscle fibers and cellular structure, nothing unusual. She made her notes methodically, trying to ignore the lingering sensation that something fundamental had shifted. Her handwriting looked different, more angular than usual, but fatigue could explain that. The refrigeration unit cycled on with a mechanical wheeze, and Maya realized she'd been holding her breath. The lab felt different somehow, as if the familiar space had shifted slightly while she wasn't paying attention. She glanced around, noting that everything appeared exactly as she'd left it, yet the wrongness persisted like a taste she couldn't swallow. She moved to prepare the next sample, trying to shake off the unease. But as she reached for the feline liver tissue, her movements felt subtly different. More fluid, more deliberate, almost predatory. Maya paused, her gloved hand hovering over the specimen container. Something was definitely wrong, but she couldn't identify what. The lab looked the same. The equipment hummed its normal mechanical symphony, yet everything felt changed, as if she were seeing her familiar workspace through different eyes. Eyes that had never been human. The feline liver tissue felt warm under her fingertips, even through the nitrile gloves. Maya told herself it was just residual temperature from the refrigerated storage, but the warmth seemed to crawl up her arms like living things burrowing under her skin. She pressed the tissue into the embedding medium and began preparing slides, fighting the urge to bring the sample closer to her face. The moment she placed the first section under the microscope, the world shifted. Territory. This space was hers. Every corner, every shadow belonged to her. The high places were best for watching, for hunting. She could sense movement in the walls, small things with quick heartbeats that needed to be caught, needed to be killed. Maya's vision changed without warning. The lab's harsh fluorescent lighting seemed too bright, but somehow she could see more clearly into the darker corners. Her pupils had dilated without her permission, and she found herself scanning the ceiling, identifying the ventilation grates as potential pathways, cataloging hiding spots she'd never noticed before. "What the hell?" she whispered, but the sound came out as almost a hiss. She forced herself to step back from the microscope, but the territorial feelings clung to her consciousness like claws. The lab didn't just feel familiar, it felt owned. Every surface seemed to carry her scent, marking it as her domain. Maya rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the strange visual shifts. But when she looked at her hands, she could have sworn she saw claws extending from her fingertips for just a moment. Fighting the urge to crouch low and prowl the perimeter of the room, Maya moved to the next specimen, bird tissue from a sparrow that had struck a window. She needed to focus, to complete her work, to ignore whatever was happening to her mind. But her hands moved without conscious direction, drawn to the tissue like iron to a magnet. The avian tissue was delicate, requiring careful handling. As soon as Maya's skin made contact, her entire sense of space exploded outward. Sky, direction, the irresistible pull of distant places, calling with magnetic urgency. South. She needed to go south. The walls of the lab suddenly felt like a cage, confining and wrong. Her bones ached with the cellular memory of flight, of riding air currents that stretched for thousands of miles. Maya stumbled backward, her arms spreading wide as if to catch wind that wasn't there. The lab's ceiling felt oppressively low. She needed height, needed to climb, needed to find the highest point and launch herself toward the horizon. The magnetic pull of migration routes tugged at her consciousness like invisible strings. Her breathing had changed, becoming rapid and shallow. Bird-like. "This isn't possible," she gasped, but even as she spoke, she was moving toward the lab's windows, drawn by an instinct that felt older than human civilization. Pattern was undeniable now. Each tissue sample brought something foreign, something that overrode her human responses with animal instincts. Dog tissue had given her the urge to run and chase. Cat tissue had made her territorial and predatory. Bird tissue filled her with migration urges and spatial disorientation. She should stop. Should call her supervisor, claim illness, leave the specimens for the day shift. But Maya found herself returning to the workstation, compelled by a hunger she didn't understand. Her hands moved without conscious direction, reaching for the next sample container. Part of her, the part that was still Maya, screamed warnings. But that part was growing smaller with each tissue she processed, overwhelmed by the accumulating layers of cellular memory that seemed to transfer through her fingertips directly into her brain. The lab no longer felt like her workplace. It felt like a feeding ground. The final specimen container sat in the refrigerated unit like a dark promise. Maya's hands shook as she read the label. Exotic tissue samples from the municipal zoo's recent necropsy. The container was larger than the others, holding sections from multiple species that had died in an outbreak. Lion.shelves, tiger.eo, wolf, bear, cobra. She should have stopped. Every rational part of her mind screamed to step away, to leave the lab, to call for help. But those rational parts were drowning in a sea of foreign instincts that demanded she continue. Her human consciousness had become a small, terrified observer trapped behind layers of accumulated animal memories. Maya opened the container with trembling fingers. The tissue samples seemed to pulse with residual life. Under the harsh lab lighting, she could swear she saw them moving, breathing, waiting. She selected the first piece, cardiac muscle from the lion, and the moment it touched her skin, Maya's world exploded. MD. Predator. Alpha. The metallic taste of blood and the deep satisfaction of the kill flooded her senses. Every living thing in her territory was either prey or competition. The fluorescent lights became the African sun, and she could smell the fierce sweat of herbivores miles away. Her muscles coiled with deadly power, and her canine teeth ached to tear flesh. But the lion's memories were immediately overwhelmed by others cascading through her nervous system. Tiger tissue brought solitary hunting instincts and the patience to stalk prey for hours. Wolf tissue flooded her with pack dynamics and the irresistible urge to howl territorial claims. Bear tissue made her want to tear apart anything that threatened her cubs. Cubs she didn't have but remembered nursing with fierce protective love. Maya's reflection in the polished steel surfaces began to change. Her features seemed to shift and flow like liquid, sometimes feline eyes with vertical pupils, sometimes the elongated muzzle of a wolf, sometimes the heavy brow of a predatory ape. The changes flickered too quickly to focus on, creating a disturbing composite of human and animal characteristics that shouldn't exist in nature. The obra tissue was the worst. When Maya touched it, cold-blooded calculation flooded her mind like ice water in her veins. She saw heat signatures instead of visible light, sensed vibrations through the floor, tasted the air for chemical traces of prey. Her spine seemed to elongate and compress with serpentine flexibility. She tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was a synthesis of roars, howls, and hisses, a noise no single species should be able to make. The cellular memories weren't just mixing, they were competing for dominance inside her skull. Maya felt her human identity dissolving under the assault of dozens of species worth of instincts, memories, and behavioral patterns. She was simultaneously predator and prey, territorial and migratory, pack animal and solitary hunter. Her reflection in the microscope's mirror showed a face that couldn't decide what it was. Human features warped and shifted continuously. Pupils changing shape, facial structure flowing like liquid, expressions cycling through emotions no human face was designed to display. Maya could no longer remember her name. The concept of names, of human language, seemed foreign and unnecessary. She was hunger and hunt, territory and dominance, instinct and survival. The laboratory around her registered as both familiar den and alien environment, depending on which animal consciousness was dominant at any given moment. She looked at her hands and saw paws, claws, talons, fins, all superimposed over human fingers that seemed increasingly wrong and inadequate for the tasks they needed to perform. The thing that had been Maya approached the remaining tissue samples with predatory anticipation, driven by a hunger that transcended any single species' needs. Dawn light filtered through the lab's windows, but the creature crouched in the corner didn't recognize the concept of morning. Time moved differently now, measured in hunting cycles and territorial patrols rather than human minutes and hours. The fluorescent lights had shut off automatically with the timer, leaving the space in the gray half-light that felt more natural to eyes that had adapted to dozens of different ways of seeing. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at 7:30 for her morning shift and found the lab door standing open. That wasn't like Maya. The night tech was meticulous about security protocols. Patricia called out a greeting as she entered, then stopped short at what she saw. Something was huddled in the corner between the specimen refrigerator and the chemical storage cabinet. It had human proportions but moved wrong, shifting its weight in a fluid motion that suggested joints bending in directions they shouldn't. When it looked up at her, Patricia saw Maya's face, but the expression was completely alien, a synthesis of predatory awareness and territorial challenge that no human features should convey. "Maya?" Patricia whispered, but the thing in the corner tilted its head with bird-like curiosity, then lowered into a distinctly feline crouch. The creature's eyes held no recognition of human speech or social connection. Instead, they assessed Patricia with the calculating hunger of a dozen different predators, determining whether she represented food, threat, or territory to be defended. When it spoke, the voice was Maya's, but the words came in fragmented growls and whispers. "Process. Specimens." Patricia backed toward the door, noting the scattered tissue samples across the work surfaces. Every container had been opened, their contents handled and somehow absorbed. The microscope slides showed smears of tissue that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if still alive despite being sectioned hours earlier. The thing that had been Maya suddenly straightened, its attention drawn by a sound Patricia couldn't hear. New deliveries were arriving, the morning's scheduled specimens from overnight emergencies. The creature's posture changed, becoming alert and anticipatory in a way that sent ice through Patricia's veins. "Fresh samples," it whispered with Maya's voice, but the tone carried overtones of pack-hunting excitement and predatory satisfaction. "So much memory. So much life." Patricia fled, her hands shaking as she called security, but she could hear movement behind her, Not quite human footsteps, but something that borrowed from the gaits of cats, wolves, and hunting birds. The sounds followed her down the hallway with patient persistence, the rhythm changing as different animal consciousnesses took control. By the time security arrived, the lab was empty except for the scattered tissue samples and a microscope that showed impossible images. Cellular structures that moved and pulsed with independent life, as if the boundary between living and dead had been dissolved, along with everything else. They found tracks in the dust near the loading dock, but couldn't identify the species that had made them. The prints seemed to shift between paw, claw, and hoof depending on the angle of observation, as if whatever made them couldn't decide what it was. The thing that had consumed Maya's identity was gone, but not far. It had learned that the city held thousands of veterinary clinics, research facilities, and laboratories. So many places where tissue samples waited to be processed, where cellular memories waited to be harvested and absorbed. Somewhere in the urban landscape, something that was no longer human or animal prepared to feed again, and with each feeding, it would become something more. A living repository of every creature's deepest instincts and memories, growing hungrier with each new species it consumed.